Welcome to Salmon Wars, the podcast where we dive deep into the challenges facing the iconic salmon of the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Cody and McLaughlin, a passionate salmon fisherman in the last frontier of Alaska. Join me as I interview a wide range of experts, including biologists, commercial and recreational fishermen, advocates, native people, politicians, and other stakeholders. Together, we'll explore the driving forces behind the dramatic decline in salmon returns and seek solutions to save these vital fish populations before it's too late. This limited-run investigative series will take you on a journey through the complex world of salmon conservation and management. Subscribe now to join the fight to protect our salmon and preserve the rich ecosystems they support. Together, we can make a difference in the future of these magnificent fish. Welcome to Salmon Wars. Tim Bristol, thank you so much for joining Salmon Wars, the podcast that is exploring what is happening to the iconic fish of the Pacific Northwest. You're coming to us from Juneau today, is that right?
Coming from Juneau. Just started raining again, unfortunately.
I was going to ask you how the weather is because it's crap.
It's been great. It's been great until today.
Yeah, it's I finally got out fishing further, like into actual open water like a week and a half ago. And then I was just super busy actually recording this show. And now that I finally have some time opening back up, it is, of course, terrible weather and all the rivers look like chocolate milk again. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Tim. You're the CEO of Salmon State. Give us a 30,000-foot view, history. What do you do? What does Salmon State do? All that stuff.
Yeah. So Salmon State's 8.5-year-old effort that is really committed to ensuring that Alaska remains the salmon state, the home of the greatest wild salmon fishery in the world. And it's really important to us to also think about the human element, what those fish mean to traditional Alaska Native cultures, to coastal communities, commercial fishermen, sport anglers, subsistence and personal use fishers. And there's a bunch of us that have worked on conservation issues in Alaska for a long time, and we realize that salmon, although the issue can be controversial at the local level and at sort of the finer scale, when you really step back, Alaskans' love for salmon is very deep and it's very broad, and oftentimes you see the issues when it comes to thinking about their conservation in the future. You can cut across a lot of the sort of traditional barriers, political, cultural. And so about 8.5 years ago, there's a small group of us, 11 staff that are committed to trying to figure out where we're at now and where we're going in the future when it comes to, I think, maybe Alaska's most important natural resource.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I certainly agree. Hence the name of the show, right?
Yep.
First of all, I thank you for your commitment to salmon. I mean, I would posit that nationwide or even really worldwide, the salmon is an iconic anadromous fish. It's the poster child for that particular group of fish, right? When you think of an anadromous fish running upriver to spawn, the Discovery Channel photo that comes to your mind is not a striped bass. It's not an American shad. And I love those fish. I've got founding fish right here next to me on the bookshelf. I'm looking right at it. But it's the salmon, and it's not just any salmon. It's the salmon of the Pacific Northwest, because these runs are just legendary, not just to anglers, but anybody who's got a passing interest in wildlife conservation or nature even has seen those photos of big sockeye runs jumping up the falls and grizzly bears chomping down on all 5 species of salmon in a riverbank. And as you say, it gets really complicated at the local level, right? Like certain aspects of road development and all these other things that come into it. And that's what we're trying to explore, is where are the issues. But let me back up for a second. And I'll start really with the same question that I'm trying to ask everybody. I'm trying to kind of lay the baseline with this one, is that, would you say that Alaska has a salmon problem right now?
There's certainly a salmon challenge. If you're looking at it through the lens of Chinook, king salmon, absolutely. We're in really desperate straits when it comes to Chinook salmon. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we're in this really unfortunate spot. Overall, I think that the picture's a lot brighter than we sometimes have a tendency to talk about, especially in the media, at least in the short form media. That's why it's great doing something like this. You get to expand on things quite a bit. I just moved back to Southeast Alaska, and I'd kind of forgotten in my 10 years away just how unbelievable the overall coho salmon numbers are here and the amount of production. I think there's close to 12,000 coho systems in Southeast Alaska. The Taku River, which is just south of Juneau, may be the biggest coho producer in the world. We don't really count coho, so we don't even know. So they're my
And that's such another like iconic fish
exactly.
that I was surprised to learn the same thing, because where I'm at down in or up in South Central from you, we are actually having some coho challenges as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we got a couple river closures last year, and that's, really compounding with the Chinook problems, but go on.
Yeah. And so there's coho in Southeast and some other places. And then, love them or hate them, there's pink salmon in record numbers throughout much of the state. And then sockeye, depending on what system you're talking about, the Kenai River continues to amaze everyone with the level of production that it has year in and year out. And out in Western Alaska, I think they're going to be back to more of a normal run in Bristol Bay at 38 or 39 million returning fish. But they had their record run a couple of years ago, and they've just been the production of the returns out there have been off the chart. So I think all of this stuff clearly is being impacted in significant ways by a rapidly warming planet. But it's pretty clear from a salmon perspective, or from the salmon frame, there's winners and losers. And, I think we just have to take the time to step back from the year in and year out returns and think about the big picture. So there's a salmon challenge. There are some significant issues going on right now, particularly with Chinook. To call it a problem, I prefer challenge. Try to be
Okay.
try to think about ways we all need to just sort of roll up our sleeves and work collectively, rather than kind of get into the doom scrolling and think that it's maybe all over.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I was in a bad headspace when I first started this series, because a lot of the news seemed very bleak that you get from experts and biologists, and to be frank, just people who rely on the resource, right? Like, I'm trying to take a very balanced view with this, is talk to some experts, but also talk to the people who were affected by it. And it seems like, as much as we have a salmon challenge, we also have a hope challenge here, right?
Exactly.
It's a lot of really bleak outlook on it. And I don't know if that's good or bad for the salmon, right? Like, I think it'll spur people to action. I think it'll get them moving and unstuck and out of the mindset of, this is a problem that we can address tomorrow. But I also think that it could, too much of it could do the reverse, right? It could really set people back in there, because you already see it a lot of times in the online spaces. People comment. I've gotten comments on this show already, and I haven't even released the full thing yet, saying that the salmon are done for, it's over, blah, blah, blah. And it's really disheartening to receive those comments when you're trying to bring awareness around an issue that's, in my opinion, eminently fixable. We've seen this story before with the Atlantic salmon. This is a story that I was sharing with a previous guest. Another book right next to me in my little library, anadromous fish conservation books, is The President's Salmon. And that's a story about the Atlantic salmon, which, I mean, within my lifetime, and I'm 31 years old, just turned 31 a couple weeks ago, within my lifetime, the first Atlantic salmon of the Penobscot River was traditionally handed to the President of the United States.
Hey.
And that was the long-standing tradition for Maine fishermen on the East Coast where a lot of people, and this is, again, still within my lifetime, but a lot of people may not even remember, where they also had a really strong salmon run of the sixth species of American salmon, which is the Atlantic salmon. And that those fish are listed under the ESU protection in the 1990s. And I mean, the Penobscot River still hasn't been fishable for salmon for 20, 30 years now. And it's still seeing minute runs of Atlantic salmon. And I mean, we're not even sure if those rivers will recover. Now, those issues were a little bit different. Sure, there was overfishing and waste and stuff like we saw here, but also, a lot of dams and things of that nature, which I know you guys do a lot of great work on as well. But we've seen this before. We've seen it in the not so distant past, and we've seen it across the western seaboard. It's been creeping up north from California's cratering salmon runs that got pretty much replaced by enhanced stocks all the way up to now it's happening here in Alaska. So you would think that we've been educated enough about it to do something about it at this point, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you'd like to think so. I think, trying to not fall into despair around salmon, it's just critical, right?
Yeah.
One, they're certainly worth fighting for. And two, I think if people give up, especially elected officials and people in leadership positions, they just, they move their emphasis to someplace else. And it's like, wow,
Mhm.
trying to bring salmon back is too difficult. It's too expensive. It's too politically challenging. Um, and they move on to something else. And I think it's our responsibility to not let them do that. And clearly with
Yeah.
Chinook salmon, it's going to be a all the above approach. There's issues that are out of our control that are going on in the ocean, but there's still a lot of habitat challenges. Not only some in Alaska and an enormous number in the Pacific Northwest that still need to be dealt with. Um, I think there are federal waters fishery management issues that are in desperate need of overhaul and reform, particularly trawling, um, and
Mhm.
a whole host of other things as well. So, but we're certainly not going to write off salmon at Salmon State.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
I think the challenge for all of this is to try to find ways to dig deeper and work a little harder. And
Yes, that's a great segue. So, as we look at this challenge, right? Like, there's so much, and this is part of what I'm trying to suss out for the average listener across the country, not just in Alaska, but really around the nation. What the goal of Salmon Wars is to educate the listener about. Most of your average listeners across the country have seen article headlines ranging from record run of red salmon to cratering Chinook salmon stocks across the Pacific Northwest to the notion that cratering salmon stocks is what's killing the orca whales off and down in Washington to, as you've said, record runs of pinks and cohos up here. Most of those people, though, have no idea that salmon are six distinct species of fish and that they're really a family of dozens of different species of fish spread out across the world, right? Like there's salmonid species in Japan and Siberia. And
right,
so help them to understand. And what I'm trying to do is cut through the clutter and help them understand. Going back to what you said earlier, there's some winners, there's some losers. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What are the differences? And why is it that in the same year that we're seeing record low Chinook runs, then in the same exact rivers that these fish all come into not exactly the same rivers all the time, but if there's pink salmon in a river, there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be Chinooks and to a lesser degree, maybe sockeye because they need a lake at the top of it. But help the listener understand who the different players are from the fish species standpoint.
well, I think it's a really important point on the clutter. I think we have to get the general public comfortable with the fact that it is a cluttered, confused, complex, nuanced landscape when you're talking about salmon, right? You're talking about a critter with Chinook that goes, in the case of the Yukon, 1,000 miles inland, and then spends most of its life cycle out in the Pacific Ocean, ranging a long way away from its natal spawning ground. So, one of the things that really attracted us when we started Salmon State was how it's such a good indicator of ecological health, a critter that essentially is inland and then is out in the open ocean, right? If you really want to get a handle on what's going on with an ecosystem, you'd be hard pressed to find a creature that's more effective than salmon. But so you have the Yukon, where we're literally looking at no Chinook salmon fishing for 7 years. You can't really describe that situation as in any other way than grave. But not that far away, you're having Bristol Bay with these incredible sockeye runs. Like the Wood River, the last few years has produced more salmon than it probably ever has, and it's certainly in its recorded history. And they can actually go back and reconstruct runs by sampling sediments from the bottom of these lakes, and they may be the biggest runs in the wood system ever. Then you have sort of technical, physical fixes, like on the Klamath down in California. It's the biggest dam removal in the history of the United States, and I think it remains to be seen whether that project is eventually successful or not. But that kind of undertaking would have been impossible to dream of 10 or 15 years ago because of the sort of the cemented in politics around that. And then you're starting to hear stories of salmon heading north, right? These critters have been around for a long time, and one of their survival strategies is to seek out new habitat as it opens up. We know that from the last ice age, and you're hearing more and more anecdotal evidence of salmon on the North Slope. And I know there's already salmon returning to the Lake Mackenzie River in Canada and those kind of things. So you wonder if one of salmon's futures is in the far north as it warms up. So I just think getting people
yeah,
sort of comfortable with that.
Good point.
All the different complexities and nuances associated with this fish, but from a policy standpoint, it's just there isn't one single fix, right? And then back to what you were saying about sort of the public perception. If it bleeds, it leads, right? So most of the stories we've been seeing lately are the awful situation in the Yukon and the impact it's having on lower Yukon Kuskokwim communities. Some of the other closures in other parts of the state, but just having the ability to step back and think about and consider the resiliency of these fish and some of the things we think are going to be necessary to rebuild some runs or help some runs recover, and then pushing really hard to sort of get to a solution.
When we talk about the different solutions and stuff, right? That's another thing that gets really cluttered for people. So they hear climate change and they think electric vehicles are going to save the salmon, which I think may contribute over the long term, but we're talking really long term in that front. There are some more immediate challenges, right? So like if you could pick you're a nonprofit organization dedicated to salmon, so maybe I should just ask directly, right? One of the top 3 issues or key initiatives that Salmon State's working on right now to try to rescue the salmon?
Well, I don't even know if we can make it 2 or 3. So one of our big issues right now are there are rivers that flow from northern British Columbia and into southeast Alaska, the transboundary rivers, the Chinook, the Stikine, and the Taku. And right now they're big, wild, beautiful, free-flowing rivers. There have been ups and downs in the returns, especially of Chinook to the Stikine and the Taku. It sounds like there's going to be potentially a little uptick in the Chinook return to the Taku this year. But again, stepping back and looking over 10, 15, 20, 25 years and looking at some of those trends, and you will find those peaks and valleys. And the thing that gets you through is protecting habitat. And in northern British Columbia, BC is essentially relabeled the transboundary as the Golden Triangle, and there are dozens of mining proposals in the headwaters of these rivers. The headwaters of those rivers are so far away from the population centers, and and southern British Columbia that they're really out of sight and out of mind for the general population in BC. So um, the mining companies have essentially just had their way up there. And so that's a big issue for us, trying to create some kind of international framework where we can, discuss mines one by one. And if you're talking about perpetual storage of acid mine waste along a river that flows from Canada into the United States, maybe that shouldn't happen. And if creating some kind of framework like they have in the Great Lakes, where you have a huge set of freshwater systems that are shared between the two countries, we don't we don't necessarily, we've been talking about, we would love to have a seat at the table. Unfortunately, right now there isn't even a table to deal with these issues. So that's a big one. So and to just to extend that out to things like preventing the construction of the Susitna Wantana Dam in South Central, which I think is on the shelf for now, but still talked about in the state legislature. Pebble Mine out in Bristol Bay, just ensuring that habitat is intact, right? Because you will get these years or even these cycles where salmon runs are strong, and then they'll weaken. Ensuring that they have high quality habitat and cold, clean water to spawn in is just one of those sort of bedrock principles you have to have in place. So overall habitat protection. I also think that, one of the things we've got to get a better handle on is the way we're managing federal waters fisheries right now, particularly when it comes to the trawl fleet, when it comes to the harvest of pollock and some other groundfish by hard on bottom and pelagic trawlers. And I think you've probably talked about this before on the show, and if you haven't, I'm sure you will in the future. But just using these very large nets that indiscriminately harvest everything in the water column, in the pursuit of pollock that goes into surimi, big crab, and fish sticks. And, that's become a pretty important issue, or a hot button or flashpoint issue in Alaska, is the bycatch Chinook and chum salmon in particular, while those nets are deployed for the harvest of pollock. And, every year they're trying to figure out how to do the best they can to minimize the incidental catch and then discarding of king salmon and chum. But it's pretty hard to do when you're dragging a net through the waters as long as a couple of football fields. And that is one of those things I think is well within human control. And
well, yeah, I mean, it's a human run boat, right? Like
exactly.
That's regulated by law, by, supposed to be regulated. And we've got the North American model of wildlife conservation that, that's a real shocking point, is that it seems like 3 miles offshore, the federal government just decides that Pittman Robertson doesn't matter anymore. And now it's the Commerce Department's job to try to manage ocean fish conservation. And through the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, we're seeing like trawl lobbyists and lawyers and stuff like get onto this council, and it's the fox is picking how many hens are locked out of the hen house, and it's shocking, really, to to a lot of people. And you're right, that's been a recurring conversation every time I ask someone that first question, about, do we have a salmon problem in this state? I get a lot of, usually it ends up a very long conversation about the human impact that we're having through trawling and other things, and then a shorter conversation on some of this stuff that you're right that we may not be able to impact in the short term, like climate change and things of that nature.
Just some of those human, things that are under human control that we can deal with now and over, say, the next decade, right? And then we'll see what happens as far as climate change goes. When it comes to management of federal waters in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea, there's a lot that can be done and can be done now. The last year, trawlers caught and threw away 35,655 Chinook. At least that's the observed bycatch. 122,000 chum. And then, in addition to salmon, I know it's salmon wars, but I think a lot of us probably also go out and fish for halibut. 4.4 million pounds of halibut was bycaught thrown away last year and recorded 1.1 million crabs and another 7.3 million pounds of herring, which is a foundational part of the food chain for Chinook salmon in particular. And then on top of that, they caught 9 orca. That's something that we can work on
Yeah,
right
how
now.
that didn't get on the front page of every newspaper.
Kind of incredible.
Yeah, yeah, I'm floored by that. I mean, when I saw that photo, I was like, oh man, we're finally gonna get some regulation changes on trawl nets. 9 orca, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But even these reliably kind of quote unquote green, if you look at their websites and their talking points and what they say on the floor of the Senate and the House, representatives and senators out of Washington, Oregon, et cetera, like they will take money from trawl, be quiet on trawl nets, scooping up 9 orcas, and then talk about how climate change is killing off the whales.
Right.
And it's like, well, if that's the problem, and I'm not denying that climate change is affecting whales, but if they are an endangered species, then why are we allowing for them to be, so it goes back to, I grew up mostly between New Jersey and Florida, and my dad worked at a construction company for a long time there. And, I remember him coming home one day and saying that they found a tortoise nest at one of their build sites, so the homeowner wasn't allowed to build there. You know what I mean? And
yep.
Hey, as a grown man, somebody who loves wildlife conservation and who's dedicated most of his adult life to wildlife, I agree with the decision, right? Like that those tortoises are critically endangered. I used to love seeing them when I was a kid, trudging through the swamps and stuff of Southeast Florida. And I would go observe the nests and whatnot. And at the time, it sounded a little silly, but growing up and learning the stakes, you get a greater appreciation for it. But if one tortoise stopped an entire house 20 years ago from being built in one of the most builder-friendly states in the country, this was during the Florida housing boom, right? Like, I don't even recognize the part of Florida that I lived in because I went back, and this was still some number of years ago, and they built over most of the swamps and backwoods and stuff that I used to go hunt and fish in, right? Catch snakes and, alligators and like all this stuff. So in a pro-development state like that, if they were able to stop, come to a screeching halt on a house because there was a single tortoise nest there, then I have to believe that there's some ability for action when we're scooping up 10 orcas, right? Like in a year, and strangling them in a trawl net, right? Like and that's again, like observed, as you said, observed bycatch, right? Like there's not 100% observability across all the trawl fisheries. And that's and that's kind of a problem with the math, right? Is that like we have to trust the number that they gave us, but even the number that they give us, which we know if anything is small, not high, right? Because they're not going to report high numbers with a 15% observability rate in certain fisheries. So if that's what's getting reported, then like it begs the question of what's really happening, and what's the true impact on these fish? Because as you said, 36,000 Chinook, 122,000 chums, right? How many? You may know the answer to this question. How many eggs? Just if we are assuming 50 to 60% of those are females, right? How many potential eggs is that? Back in the Yukon River system, where they badly need them more, or even here in the Parks Highway system, or the Kenai.
Yeah, and it's really challenging. It gets back to this whole concept of just throwing your hands up in despair and saying, "Oh, forget it." I've heard responses from the trawl industry, essentially saying that a couple of years ago, and it was 500,000 chum that were bycaught, and the genetics showed that a large majority of those bycaught chum were of Asian hatchery origin. It was probably 65,000 Yukon Kuskokwim bound chums that were bycaught. And, they were like, so it's just not that much. And the response from my coworker, who was interviewed by a newspaper about this, well, 65,000 is a lot more than none. And that's how many chums the folks on the Yukon and Kuskokwim are allowed to catch. And then, I will say, I think the trawl industry is doing everything it possibly can while still ensuring they make huge profits to reduce their Chinook bycatch. But if you look at some of the historical numbers of the number of Chinook that were scooped up by trawlers, it's into the hundreds of thousands. And you wonder what happened to those entire age classes of Chinook. And with all the other things that are going on with climate change and competition from hatchery fish and ironically predation from orca and other marine mammals, which are, outside of Puget Sound, really going up in numbers, to take that many salmon out when they're in the middle of their life cycle and then just throwing them dead overboard, that's had a huge negative impact on the trajectory of salmon runs on the Yukon and the Kuskokwim. The funny thing about orcas in particular really illustrate how complex these issues are. So you have the southern resident killer whales, if you're talking about down in Puget Sound, and they've become a real sort of flashpoint for people's concerns about the environment. A conservation group, I don't even know what to call them. They're basically serial Endangered Species Act litigators. They have challenged whether the Southeast Alaska troll fishery, which is the hook and line fishery, should be allowed to continue. And they're alleging that the trollers in Southeast Alaska are having a huge negative impact on the survival of southern resident killer whales in Puget Sound. The whole thing, excuse my language, is total bullshit. Majority of the Chinook there consumed by those southern resident killer whale come from the Fraser River in Canada, which flows through Vancouver and is in really lousy shape. There are some people out there who just want to end harvest of salmon. And I think that that's a huge mistake. I think if you take people and make their living off the resource, whether it's charter captains or commercial fishing families, you just have that many fewer people that have a direct connection to the resource. And in my experience, and having done this for almost 30 years now in Alaska, those people end up being some of the most compelling and passionate spokespeople for protecting the resource. They understand.
Well, it's about
using it.
It's about value.
It's about value.
Yeah. Another show that I work on, it's called Blood Origins, seeks to kind of explore the same issue around hunting. And that is that when wildlife pays, it stays, right? So that's why if we lose the ability to have a direct connection to these salmon, as you just said, we stand to lose the entire species, because all of a sudden there's going to come a day when there's only 50 salmon. So are we, we've all heard the famous quote about stopping logging for a couple of owls, right? Down in Oregon. I can't think of this quote off the top of my head, but that's the mentality that you run into once it gets to a certain point where somebody's going to throw up their hands and say, well, it's over.
Yep. And I think we have to avoid that, and back to the policy issues. I think it's doing everything you possibly can to keep habitat in an intact state, free flowing rivers, all that good stuff. There's definitely a need for reform of the way we're managing federal fisheries off of Alaska, and reining in the excess of the troll fleet. Even I do it. I know tons of trollers. I try really hard to not make that mistake of the trawl fleet. And then I think continuing to put pressure on Alaska Department of Fish and Game when it comes to hard policy choices. I think, what they decided to do on the Yukon is probably necessary, but I want them to be consistent, right? Because the majority of the people that sit on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council that have the say over how much bycatch we allow, majority of those people are appointed by the governor of Alaska. So trying to make sure that that strong response when the need arises is consistent across the landscape.
All right, so switching gears a little bit, we've examined the overarching policy issues. We've talked a little bit about what some of those are, although I don't think we talked quite enough about hatcheries because that's another issue affecting salmon. That's something that's also been covered by, documentaries and things of that nature. So down to the individual, right? All politics is local. I'm a recovering political consultant. You work in the political arena on behalf of salmon. What role can the individuals or individual communities play in supporting salmon conservation efforts? Like, what can the average listener, not just here in Alaska, but your average listener in Missouri or Montana or Florida who have a dream of someday flying up to Alaska for a bucket list trip to catch a big king, what can they do today to help support salmon conservation?
Well, I think in Alaska, this incredible system of advisory committees that meet usually in the winter and come up with proposals that go to the Alaska Board of Fisheries and the Alaska Board of Game. It's that, it's the Churchillian, it's the worst form of government except for every other. It's very democratic. Participating in those kind of processes, I think, is really valuable. I think keeping apprised of maybe a couple of issues that are really important to you and consistently weigh in with your elected officials at the state level. And then our congressional delegation, when it comes to federal waters management, the Representative Peltola ran on sort of a fish and family platform. I think she's found out pretty quickly that there's a lot of money behind the federal water fisheries, behind the trawlers. And I think that's, her response has been kind of a mixed bag at this point. Senator Sullivan's on the Commerce Committee, and federal fisheries, as you mentioned, are managed by the, Department of Commerce, incredibly. So I think, I think probably more correspondence with Senator Sullivan, ask him to take a harder look and listen to maybe a little more closely to what people are saying from across the political spectrum in Alaska. And the same goes for Senator Murkowski. And then around the United States, I think, weigh in with your members of Congress. The waters off of Alaska are owned by every single one of us, and we all have a stake in their future, and all get to have a say in the matter. I think that's the thing that the trawlers have done really effectively is just sort of shrouded this, been able to just keep it out of the public's eye to a certain point. I think that's changing. But I think the question for the entire country is this an appropriate way to harvest fish? It may be sustainable when it comes to pollock, but it's certainly having a huge negative impact on almost everything else that's in the ocean. And I think that's a question for everybody that needs to ask and maybe ask their elected official about.
I agree with you. The shrouding of this issue is really, and that's kind of what Salmon Wars is trying to do, addressing the misinformation, the lack of information. What are some of the key messages or takeaways, if you will, that you hope listeners will glean from this conversation, this series? What are you hoping people are going to take from this?
The salmon are resilient, and they're incredibly important to so many people for a variety of different reasons. Their food, their foundation to the culture. I think one of the reasons why a lot of us live here in Alaska to try to pursue them and catch them. And there's still an opportunity to get this right. I really believe that, but it's going to take the collective will of the United States public to make that happen. I would submit that happened in the case of Bristol Bay. It was 15 years slugging it out, trying to prevent the construction of the largest open pit gold and copper mine in North America, the headwaters are our biggest salmon fishery. And, that was a truly bipartisan effort. You had sport fishermen and commercial fishermen and Alaska natives who had traditionally not gotten along very well over salmon issues come together, and you saw two different presidents from two different parties take proactive action to protect the place. So it can be done, but it's going to take that kind of effort if we're gonna save salmon throughout the range. And then think about the future. And it's pretty clear the planet's warming up, and where are those salmon going to go? And think about what if they start to colonize some of those rivers on the North Slope. What's that going to look like? Who's going to be responsible for the management? Who's going to make the decisions when it comes to commercial fishing off the coast of the Arctic? And it's the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. So, and then just think about some of the reforms that are going to be needed to ensure we have sustainable runs in the future.
So what are some of those reforms? Just 30,000-foot view, like tick them off.
Well, I think National Marine Fish, or the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act, which governs federal waters fisheries. It should have been opened and updated a while ago, but that's become a really tough issue politically. There are a series of standards, sort of the 10 commandments for its implementation, that we're advocating be updated. It's standards 4, 8, and 9. If you want to find out all the details about that, you can check out our website, salmonstate.org/bycatch. And there's a letter to the requisite federal officials dealing with those 3 standards. They deal with basically ecosystem kind of based management and equity and access to the fishery, and then a few other provisions that I think it makes a pretty significant change in the short and midterm. And then I think support efforts to preserve and protect habitat, support efforts to restore places that have been impacted by development in the past. And then I think it's just a consumer, try to make educated choices on what you buy when it comes to seafood. I know it can get really confusing, but I would submit that if you can find wild Alaskan salmon, fresh or frozen, that's usually a good choice. Yeah, you can just visit our website at www.salmonstate.org, and we're up on all the social media platforms. We're pretty easy to find, and we try to be pretty consistent in placing a lot of cutting edge information on those platforms, especially about some of the federal fisheries management issues going on right now.
Fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for joining Salmon Wars. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate what you're doing. I'm on the board of the Alaska Outdoor Council, and even though we disagree sometimes on certain policy, as you alluded to earlier, saving these fish is about more than strict party or political lines, right? Like it's more of a silver party than I think a lot of interest groups are willing to admit. So thank you on behalf of the fish. I appreciate the work you guys are doing over at Salmon State to make sure that we have runs long into the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate the opportunity, and there's a lot of great work going on at AOC, especially on the trawl issue. So really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. This is Salmon Wars.